Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. Patch 11.2 is almost here, which is super exciting, as I am somebody who is so ready for some brand new content with new zones, new raids, new dungeons, new everything, but also a bunch of new class changes on the horizon. But these number of class changes have also made it much harder for players struggling to figure out which class they're going to main for 11.2. However, your decision of what class you were leaning towards maining likely is going to be on the up end because of a bunch of new buffs that are just sweeping all across the board on the PTR, nerfing a handful of playstyles that have been overperforming, but also buffing many underperforming options as well. And as part of the way of me trying to keep you guys all in the loop of everything happening to 11.2, I wanted to go over a massive number of class changes that we saw on PTR recently, going over every single buff and nerf in an alphabetical order for all of our classes. As you can see, it's kind of a long video, so I want to jump into it as soon as possible. But right before that, if you guys want to keep up with any class changes and class guides for the patch 11.2 once that releases, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. So the first thing we got to talk about is a massive cloak buff for the artifact cloak, which is going to be one of those unique items we'll be getting and progressing with throughout patch 11.2. Similar to artifact weapons, but not in the same way, it's just going to be like a cloak with a powerful bonus effect. It doesn't have much in terms of secondary stats, though you can select and slot in different fibers, so you can control some secondary stats, but a huge portion of this cloak is going to be the bonus effect, which is different depending on your role, whether you're DPS, healer, or tank, and so far the cloak has underperformed by a decent bit over on the PTR, with it being your only cloak item. They want to make sure it's the best one out there, so they want to make sure it gets a substantial buff, especially for tanks in particular. They're starting off, the DPS Ethereal Reaping effect is being buffed up by 152%. Yeah, that just tells me everything. Like, the cloak was just not performing, and right now, fully upgraded, the cloak should do about like 1 million damage, if not more. It also does deal additional damage to enemies below 35% health, so it does have some execute potential. So hopefully this is going to make the cloak a little bit more powerful. But any classes that are burst heavy, like a Mythic Plus Dungeons, if you're running with, like, I don't know, tanks that don't really have a lot of snap aggro, like a Bear Druid for instance, it'd be kind of hilarious to see if this cloak ends up actually pulling aggro from players at the start of a pull, but the effect itself for DPS is a substantial increase. For healers, the cloak's effect is going to be a little bit more on the healing variety. It's called Ethereal Constitution, which allows your abilities to randomly proc a heal on an injured ally, doing a burst of healing to them, and any overhealing becomes a shield to make sure that healing isn't wasted. So this effect also, just like the DPS, got buffed up by 152%. So a nice sizable increase towards your overall proc healing. It is for tanks where the cloak itself just wasn't quite living up to expectations, so they ended up buffing it even further than tanks or than DPS and healers. So their effect is Ethereal Protection, which allows your ability sometimes to generate a shield where a portion of the damage you take, 20%, goes into that shield. Falling below 40% health allows you to gain the same effect, but at 500% effectiveness, but can occur once every 6 minutes, so it's kind of like a cheat death mechanic back into the cloak. The shield itself was fairly weak, so they buffed it by 200%, so now you can get yourself a 20% damage reduction on the way up until that shield is consumed. So in some cases it can be better, but I could totally see this cloak getting buffed up just a little bit more for tanks, because we're dealing with health pools of 20 million and getting a shield of 3.4, but only 20% of the damage goes to the shield. I think the shield with the 20% offset damage is probably better than full absorb. In some cases, I think it can basically work like a damage reduction effect to some of the various powerful effects, but it's not going to save you from any kind of one-shots, and it can just be soaked up by a single enemy ability, so it just is something that can smooth out your damage intake rather than stop it completely, which I usually like those effects when it comes to my tanks in particular. Though, again, like I said before, I still think 2.4 is a little bit of a low number for the health pools we'll be running with in this update, so I could totally see them buffing it up slightly further in the process. From there, though, we do have a number of different class changes for a variety of different playstyles out there, but we'll start off with classes like Death Knight. Some of these changes are going to be very simple, while others are going to be a little bit more nuanced. With Death Knight being a little more nuanced, I'm going to go into a bit more detail on them. With some of the simple classes, there's just not much to really talk about. With Death Knights in particular, Rite of the Apocalypse does get slight nerfs basically everywhere for Frost and Unholy. They nerf some of the components of it, like the Undeath Dot, which is part of the White Main playstyle, so that is going to impact Unholy Death Knights a little bit more because they'll have better uptime of White Main. But Frost also does get some nerfs towards Trollbane, so Rite of the Apocalypse just takes a slight hit, which makes Deathbringer Frost and Sinlay and Unholy slightly better. But right now on PTR, this is still up to tuning, and I wouldn't be surprised if they added even more changes down the line in order to try to find a balance between all the different hero specs. For Blood Death Knights, we're seeing a buff of 8% for all ability damage, which is quite sizable. This is going to give them a little bit more damage, but it's also going to make it easier for them to hold aggro, as all the DPS cloaks can now deal additional snap damage out of nowhere. So for Blood Death Knight, being able to deal a bit more damage can also work for a bit of self-heal, because the harder you hit, the harder you can heal yourself. So for them, it's a offensive, but also somewhat of a survivability buff as well. Out of the 3 specs of Death Knight, Frost is the only one that actually saw a slight damage nerf, though this being literally the best melee for a number of weeks right now on the PTR, it wasn't expected we're going to receive some sort of a nerf. Though it's not the end of the world, it's only a 3% ability damage nerf. That's it. I don't know if they're going to be doing any more tuning with it. It looks like they've been very, very careful to not over nerf Frost Death Knight. They've nerfed him a number of times with PTR, and they still continue to be the best melee option for Mythic Plus and raid testing. So I wouldn't be surprised if they do like slight 2%, 1% changes here and there. They did end up buffing up a couple of talents, however, that weren't scaling super well, like Howling Blades, which wasn't scaled with the Mastery. Now it does, which gains quite a significant bit of a gain. Also, the capstone of Frostbane does get buffed up by 15% in order to make that playstyle that cleaves multiple targets with this like Frost Strike that AoEs things. They buffed it up by 15% to try to make it a little bit more competitive. The change for Unholy Death Knights is in fact a little bit weird, I'm not gonna lie, as they ended up buffing one of the runes specifically for Unholy. That is the Rune of the Apocalypse. This rune is weird because it doesn't get a lot of play, but this is one of those runes that you can engrave into your weapon, which allows your ghoul's attacks a chance to apply one of the following debuffs to a target. For debuff of Death, which provides healing reduction on the enemy, War, which causes Death Knight to increase damage to the target, Famine, which reduces damage dealt to the Death Knight from the target, and Pestilence, which slows the target and deals some damage over time. Like, the actual effect itself is a little bit limited in its overall value because it's just hard to really make it work properly and optimally, as it primarily just works off of your main ghoul damage and scales off of that main ghoul damage specifically. As you can see, as your ghoul deals damage, you'll apply various different buffs like Pestilence, which causes the enemies to be slowed and take more damage. We have Death, which causes healing reduction. We have War, which has been buffed up. War is what's really been buffed up for this rune. It now scales it for Death Knight to be a little bit better, to be 4% damage increase per stack. It looks like it's a little more than just 4. It looks like it's like 4 point something extra. So technically it can stack up to like 40%. The problem with this effect is it's RNG. It's all based on every time the ghoul strikes the target, he has a chance to apply a random disease to that target. Sometimes you can get War, sometimes you can get other effects instead. So there's not a lot of consistency with it outside of maybe stacking haste and getting the ghoul to be further empowered, maybe by going for like a full Apocalypse type of a build where you have Ghoulish Frenzy, where the attack speed of the ghoul is further amplified, so at least you could, you know, hit a little faster, so you could stack up variety of these different benefits on the enemy. It's very, very weird of a debuff, but they ended up buffing it. I feel like maybe they really committed a lot of attention into the debuff mechanic and maybe allowed other undeads to also be able to apply the effect. Maybe this rune could be really, really good, because for the longest time it's been a bit of a meme in the community. Like, the damage of it is usually just not really all that good. But maybe in some situations, maybe this change with a slight buff to War, maybe it makes it good in some situations. It's so hard to tell. It used to be like a mechanic that was part of the artifact weapon, and there was like a way to apply it very, very rapidly and consistently. But the version that we have with the rune weapon is just not nearly as consistent. So it's really hard to tell if this is a buff or not, but at least technically a buff towards the rune that doesn't really see a lot of play when it comes to the overall grand scheme of things. Moving on, we got some classes that will be able to rapid fire from here on out, with Vengeance Demon Hunter getting an 8% damage buff all across the board. So for a somewhat of a damage heavy tank, this actually is a fairly sizable increase for them in general. This is really, really good for them. So they did end up nerfing the mastery a little bit, with the actual Mastery of Fell Blood effectiveness reduced by 17%. Fell Blood directly increases your survivability by increasing your armor passively and doubling up whenever you have ice spikes or demon spikes active. So I think they're just trying to take it very, very carefully with demon hunters, because they are a very, very strong tank in season 2, and they're probably just trying to make sure they don't end up somehow becoming the go-to, the must-have, the only viable option for season 3 Mythic Plus. At least that's my assumption in terms of trying to make him just a little bit squishier. Next, we have Druid buffs all across the board, with Balanced Druid getting an 8% damage increase, which is quite sizable. Feral Druid also getting an 8% damage increase for all of their abilities. Doesn't change the builds for either one of them, but it's just going to amplify what exists. And even Guardian got buffed up by 12% on all ability damage, which actually has some damage to healing conversion or damage to defense conversion. So in a sense, it actually can buff up some of those survivability options as well, whether you play the Lunar build of Chosen of Elune, or if you're playing the Druid of the Claw with the Bleed Thrash heavy playstyle. Next, we got some changes and mostly buffs for the class of the Evoker, starting with a couple of hero talent tier sets for Chrono Warden, which is available for augmentation and preservation. One of the playstyles of Chrono Warden is transforming the ability of Tip the Scales, which normally is just an ability you press, and it causes the next empowerment ability to be instant cast instead of having to, build it up with that empowerment mechanic. And instead, it actually gives you a window of temporal burst. So it gives you a huge buff, giving you haste, giving you movement speed, cooldown recovery. So it becomes like a cooldown for you to use as preservation or augmentation to further amplify your damage or healing. And the tier set further amplifies that effect, lowering the cooldown of the Tip the Scales to 1 minute, so you can use it more regularly. And now they added a bonus effect to the Force set. Force set normally causes abilities to cleave to multiple targets, but now there's a damage window and a heal window with it. While Tip the Scales, or rather Temporal Burst, is active, you now increase the Essence ability damage and healing by 30%. So this is actually kind of sizable. For augmentation, that's noticeably more damage, quite a bit overall. For preservation, it's a little bit different though, because a lot of the healing isn't quite through essence abilities. It is going to give him some opportunity to deal damage with Disintegrate, as there will be a little bit more scaled up for damage if you're trying to play like a Mythic Plus scale build. But their essence abilities for healing are things like Echo, which isn't necessarily a big heal on its own, but it's a primer so that the next heal afterwards can be duplicated. So I guess it's a buff there. What this, however, does end up buffing quite substantially though is Emerald Blossoms, which on their own do a decent bit of healing. They're a little bit mana hungry, and you really need to have a very specific build to be able to drop a bunch of these in a raid setting. But this playstyle directly amps Emerald Blossom AoE healing in raids, which is interesting because it might give Emerald Blossom some opportunity to shine in the future, as it is the one essence ability that it can be directly buffed by this effect. That's a little bit more impactful than Echo in terms of the AoE healing that it can provide. And if you take enough talents, you can actually further amplify the Emerald Blossom and the Emerald Blossom loop. So this is pretty good for them in particular. Outside of this, Scale Commander also got buffed up by a decent bit. One of the main components of Scale Commander is to mark enemies with bombardment. And anytime you or your allies deal damage to the target, an Evoker can fly by and bombard the target, dealing immediate volcanic damage split amongst all enemies. Now bombardments have bit of more scaling, and the scale with talents such as Might of the Black Dragonflight, Melt Armor, as well as other damage buffs that can also even be procced by other players as well. So this gives bombardment some much needed damage that was actually missing out on, making the effect a little bit better and potentially pulling Scale Commander forward in some situations. Outside of this, Evokers did get buffs, but it's not more of a generic more than anything. Like Augmentation got buffed up in damage by 5% all across the board, which is nice. Devastation also got buffed up by 3% with some targeted buffs on top of it. Abilities like Pyre, which deals a large number of AoE damage, got buffed up by 20%. To further empower the red-based playstyle of Devastation, they also buffed up the damage of Firestorm by 20% as well. So it makes a whole red-based gameplay, or red dragon gameplay, or rather the Flame Shaper gameplay, which usually those talents really heavily play into. That playstyle becomes a little bit better because of these changes. Now, another class on the list that saw tuning is Hunter, though unfortunately both Marksmanship and Beast Mastery saw even more nerfs, with the only spec escaping any nerfs is Survival, which has been really flying under the radar recently. Some of the changes they did is to change up the pack leader and further nerf it. Its tier said the procs stampede effect is very strong, so they further nerfed it by 20%. So those of you expecting to play some easy AoE pack leader, it looks like Blizzard is making it a little bit harder for all of you Beastmaster hunters out there. Dark Ranger also doesn't fare that much better, though it is a slightly better and improved playstyle for Beast Mastery, though it's not nearly as popular on the PTR. Talents like the Bell Tolls and Phantom Pain are receiving the damage amp for Beast Mastery, though I don't think these numbers are final by any measure, as the hero talent stuff and tuning is still ongoing. Black Arrow for Marksmanship, however, did get nerfed by 8%, which was a very popular playstyle, so maybe some Marksmanship hunters might want to consider, maybe in the future, potentially switching over to Sentinel afterwards. However, even if you did that, Sentinel also saw some nerfs as well, as they continue to do a bit of tuning for the tier set, which amplifies the damage of those aim shots further whenever you get the proc of that Lunar Storm capstone, which I still think this tuning is going to be ongoing, but it is a slight nerf there as well. So Marksmanship has nowhere to go, with both Dark Ranger and Sentinel seeing some buffs across the board. Oh, I almost missed it. Beast Mastery continues to get kicked down even further. They nerfed all damage for BM by 5% as well, which is something that we've seen happen week after week after week now. They've been nerfing this thing steadily, slowly into the ground it feels. This is really a curse of the Hunter. Every single new expansion, patch cycle, PTR, they start out really strong just for some reason or another, and then they continue to nerf them and then nerf them and then nerf them. And somehow the class is probably going to come out actually very strong and competitive at the start of the season before Blizzard nerfs them yet again. I think this is something that we've seen happen over a number of patches and expansions at this point. So honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if something like this happened again. Not saying that I'm hoping for that, you know what I mean? I don't want any hunters to get mad at me. It's just as a trend that we've observed over the past few patches and expansions, and I imagine this trend is probably going to continue onwards. Now, another spec that's receiving even more additional changes is going to be the spec of Fire. Specifically, a very peculiar playstyle of Frostfire is getting buffed up all across the board. So, to me, in my personal opinion, Frostfire is one of the best combos out there, so I am pretty happy on it. But anybody that was looking to play some Phoenix gameplay, it looks like Blizzard is kind of trying to take away from that just a little bit. When it comes to Frostfire, we have a number of buffs, like Frostfire Burst from Excess Fire, damage buffed by 50%, which is kind of wild. Then you also have the Novas from the Ice Novas from the Flame Phoenixes from Excess Frost, changed up and buffed up to now be cast at 200% effectiveness, which is kind of strong. They also buffed up their tier set for Mana Forge Omega for all the different elements of fire specifically. So just about everything from specific damage jams to the Pyroblast procs to the Glacial Spike tuning, just about everything got buffed up all across the board. However, they did nerf Ignite for fire mages slightly, as now Ignite has been nerfed by about 10%. With Ignite being a decent mechanic for Frostfire, but being definitely more sequential for Sun Fury, as they're trying to make Sun Fury less the go-to while trying to make Frostfire a little bit more competitive. On top of it, to make sure the Ignite doesn't get out of control, talents such as Controlled Destruction will now increase Ignite damage by 0.3% per stack instead of 0.5% for every Pyroblast and Fireball on the target. However, they also ended up to make sure that you really want to be viable to play Frostfire. They buffed up the damage of Meteor, which directly scales with Frostfire. Meteor's damage being buffed up by 20%. So it looks like Fire Mage as Frostfire may have some future ahead of it going forward. Moving on, we have new buffs for the spec of Windwalker. One being the tier set of Shadowpan, which has gotten buffed up quite a decent bit recently. So, quick rundown of Shadowpan. The main mechanic of this playstyle is to spend energy pretty aggressively. As you spend energy, you'll be able to, or as you deal damage, you build up these stacks of flurry strikes, and after you spend so much energy, you unleash those flurry strikes, dealing a ton of damage to the target, plus additional damage for each charge that you add. Every time you proc flurry strikes, you also activate the capstone, which grants you a random buff, which could either be critical strike damage increase, dodge and critical strike chance increase based on your versatility, flurry strikes deals additional shadow damage, which is very strong, or just amps up your mastery by 25%. So the more often you get the procs of the flurry strikes, the more often you could be rolling into one of the buffs of Wisdom of the Wall. And the tier set essentially allows them to do that a lot more aggressively, allowing to increase the damage the flurry strikes does by a solid bit, but also lowering the threshold without force node of how much energy you need to spend before you unleash the flurry strike charges. So this allows you to just rapidly fist at the target, rapidly fire enough flurries after one after another, proccing that capstone and then having it overlap with other capstone effects. They buffed it up so that you need even less energy than before. So this makes it a very bursty playstyle every time you use your Storm, Earth, and Fire as a Windwalker monk. Outside of this, Windwalker also saw a 5% damage buff on top of it, which is really good to see. I have not been seeing a lot of Windwalkers on PTR, but hopefully this going to change. At least will make Shadowpan and Windwalker hopefully a little bit more viable for that endgame progression going forward. Next, we have the class of the Priest, starting with the Shadow, and Shadow being the only spec that really got any changes. Mind Blast got buffed up for them by 30%, though it doesn't apply for abilities like Void Blast. Mindflight Insanity damage is being increased by 20%. The damage of Halo got also buffed up by 30%, and Psychic Link now has a bit better cleave capability, buffed up to 40% cleave onto targets with VT. So that's pretty good. However, the talent of Insidious Ire damage amplification has gotten nerfed by a solid bit. It is now nerfed from 20 to 40% of a stat increase to 10 to 20. So basically half the value, which probably is why I think they're buffing up the effectiveness of Mind Blast baseline. Though this is also going to impact the effectiveness of the Void Torrent as well, which is rather unfortunate. We also got very good news for Elementals Shamans, as they're getting buffed all across the board, some of the biggest buffs possible. First of all, Elemental as Farseer hasn't seen that much play, but they're trying to make it a little bit better, with the actual Ancestral Summon increasing their chain lightning damage by 40%. I think they're trying to make Farseer a little bit more comparable, if not maybe slightly closer to competitive to Stormbringer. I don't think that's going to be easy. That's a tall order, but I think they're just trying to make Farseer at least better in some cleave situations and primarily good for like raid cleaving in general. Outside of this though, Elemental is being buffed up all across the board with none of these buffs impacting them in PvP whatsoever. Things like Elemental Blast buffed up by 25%, and so is Earthshock, so males from spenders are far more effective. Lightning Bolt and Lava Burst base damage has also got buffed up by 35%, which is kind of massive. Even the ability of Frost Shock got buffed up by 50%, which by itself would be decent. However, Ice Fury, which further amplifies the effectiveness of Frost Shocks, that also got buffed up by 35%. As well as the passive of Earthen Rage damage, which isn't necessarily anything amazing, but it does get amped up also by 35% as well. So that's a fairly sizable buff for Elemental all across the board, which should hopefully make him potentially somewhat of a consideration going forward heading into Season 3. For the class of Warlock, we got a bit of a mixed bag of changes with some nerfs for Demonology as Diabolus and buffs for Affliction. For Demonology as Diabolus, they actually recently buffed up Diabolus Demo quite a decent bit. However, now they're having to roll back some of those buffs, so it still is going to be a gain compared to, like, you know, heading from Season 2 into Season 3, but it is going to make things a little bit less one note with Diabolus. First of all, the tier set that causes you to spawn these eyeballs that get flung at your target, dealing instant single target damage and AoE damage, that whole portion of the tier set got nerfed by 45%. That is a sizable reduction, and the numbers really do speak for itself. That is a sizable nerf of overall damage, which previously was a huge portion of your decent damage as a Warlock. I mean, look at the Eye Blasts flying at the target, doing up to 12 million damage a pop. Now got nerfed by 45%, which is super unfortunate to see. Outside of this, all of the demon damage, the actual passive demonic effects for the 3 demons summoned by Diabolus got nerfed. The Wicked Cleave from the Overlord nerfed by 20%. The Chaos Salvo from the Mother of Chaos nerfed by 20%, and the Pit Lord's Fellseeker ability also nerfed by 20%. However, while Demonology does get some nerfs, Affliction gets some buffs primarily for single target damage. UA, the damage over time dot, now could do 4.1 million damage over 21 seconds, buffed up by 35%, which is sizable. This impacts PvE as well as PvP. Summon Darkglare also got buffed up to have its damage be increased by 35%, though Darkglare's damage does not have any kind of direct buffs or PvP content in particular. Finally, the talent of Focus Malignancy causes Malefic Raptures to deal 80% increased damage to targets suffering from unstable affliction, buffed up from 40% to make it a lot stronger for pure single target damage output and priority damage output. Though this effect does not apply for PvP, just like the Darkglare change. Finally, we have slight changes for the class of Warrior to the DPS specs of Arms and Fury. Arms damage got buffed up by 5%, all ability damage specifically, and the same change also happens for Fury Warrior as well. This isn't necessarily going to change the way that either one of those specs plays, but it is a slight damage amp for that endgame progression either way. Then with that, as always, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Also, join our Discord community, especially if you want to keep up with any last minute class changes for the patch 11.2, which is releasing oh so soon. And also, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.